Good afternoon from Raleigh, North Carolina. Good afternoon. Um, there's actually quite a few things I wanted to talk about. One of them was in regards to Afrofuturism, but I think I'm going to do an audible here. Um, and one of those, and a couple of audibles, but one of those audibles is going to be chattel slavery because I hear people who've often said, okay, but do you understand what chattel slavery is or the ramifications of chattel slavery? They use the whole word, right? They use, well, they use, complete term, obviously chattel and slavery are two words. But I don't know if they know what chattel slavery is. Okay, I think they know what chattel slavery is. I just don't think they know the term as well as they think they may. For sure, they definitely know what slavery is. And for the most part, I think they've got it. But I don't think they understand what chattel is. The chattel in chattel slavery. Um, One example is a video I used to show, and it's a bit aged now. And I used to swear by it, and I still swear by it. But it was Africans in America, and I believe it was the first volume. It was talking about how we were moving from indentured servitude, um, where blacks were indentured servants into slavery. It's interesting. I remember I was hearing someone, Reverend Al Sharpton, who I actually um, why to agree with most things on. But it didn't seem that he was aware that there was a transition, but that before you got to chattel slavery, there actually was a step before then, where blacks were purchased and probably were supposed to be slaves, but eventually, from the Dutch, but there really wasn't a system for slavery yet. Um, for chattel slavery, and so they actually went into indentured servitude and then got into chattel slavery. At any rate, in the so-called terrible transformation um, episode of Africans in America, the narrator Angela Bassett says that in Virginia they create a system where basically blacks, that slaves would be reduced to real estate. Now, see, right then and there, we have an issue. Um, it's also interesting because there were a number of noted, if you will, scholars, including Peter Wood, who had worked at Duke, um, pretty much next door to me here in Raleigh, basically. Um, and there were other solid scholars there, and I don't think they caught it either. And see, this is where I think that folks do struggle with the term. All right, so I'm almost 4 minutes into this. What is chattel? Chattel is basically any property that can be moved. Um, we might be going a little far with this, but hey, I pretty much own these keys. They could be moved, technically chattel. The car that I have is parked out by, I'm in the park, where they're playing disc golf. Chattel. The disc that these folks are throwing, chattel. Um, Livestock, chattel. Also, slaves. As much as we don't like to consider them property, and discuss this, we're considered property, but also chattel. So chattel is anything, if you will. It's always amazing here. I'm always running into noises. But anyway, chattel is basically just about any property that can be moved. Hey, wait a minute. Well, isn't that just about everything? What about your home? I guess you could move it, but boy, that'd take a lot of work, right? Basically, your home is considered what? Real estate. So basically, chattel is any property that is not real estate. So basically, what Angela Bassett said was off. um, by the way, dated but fantastic, if you will, documentary on African Americans, um, you know, basically antebellum, basically. Um, but that's basically what chattel is. So basically, when we're talking about chattel slavery, we're talking about um, saying that slaves are property, because it's also possible that you could possibly have slaves and then have a strange dynamic where they may not be property per se, right? You know, indentured servants, they're basically being enslaved, right? But they're not considered property. You know, what's also interesting is I wonder how this would play out as we look at serfdom. Um, because, well, for one, serfs are, I'm not sure, I guess you probably wouldn't consider them property, but also here's another thing. Technically speaking, serfs were tied to the land. You know, how would you look at them? But basically, as we're looking at chattel slavery, like I said, I think they got everything else. They nailed the slavery part, but they didn't quite understand, or folks don't quite understand what chattel is. So chattel slavery is basically saying the slaves are property, but they also can indeed be moved. So, for example, you could sell your slaves, right? You know, if we were basically going to tie the slaves to the land, then you may have an argument to say, hey, well, these slaves can't move. Well, under chattel slavery, these slaves can be moved, can be sold, can be so on and so forth. So, so once again, I think it's important to not only, you know, remember what the slavery part is, but that's what chattel means. And I was listening to people and they were talking about it like they were experts. And they kept saying chattel and they kept throwing that around, but they didn't quite understand what chattel was, or it didn't appear to me. Anyway, that's more time than I needed to take. Hey, y'all, take care and goodbye.